The weight in your shoulders begins to loosen as Fyodor Dostoevsky steps gently into our story. Your breath might feel a little cooler now, moving slowly in and out as you notice the quiet texture of the blanket beneath your hands. Before he was the man remembered for his intense novels and heavy questions. He was simply a human being moving through a world of uncertainty. For now, he is simply Fyodor. He once stood in the center of a public square, believing that only minutes of life remained. As he watched the winter sun touch the church domes, he felt the cold air against his skin and the weight of a heavy coat as he waited for the end. But the end did not come. That experience would stay with him forever, finding its way into the pages he would later fill with reflections on time and the value of an ordinary day. We will not stay at the firing squad tonight, for that scene is only a distant frame around a much longer journey through the years. He was a man of many returnings. Instead, we will travel back to a quieter time when his life was just beginning beside a hospital garden in Moscow where the air was warm. We start in the 1820s, where the city is soft with the sound of bells and the air carries the scent of summer grass. The world was wide then. Let the city sounds fade away as we find him there, a child listening to the murmur of the hospital courtyard and the gentle turning of pages in the evening lamplight. This is the story of a man who walked through the winter and found the spring, a story for a quiet night and a resting mind. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky entered the world in the autumn of 1821, born in a humble wing of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor in Moscow. This was a place where the boundaries between the world of the healthy and the world of the suffering were thin yet for a young boy. The family's apartment inside the hospital grounds was a sanctuary of safety and soft light. Outside the windows, the hospital courtyard was often filled with the murmur of voices and the slow, heavy footsteps of those seeking care from his father, while the scent of medicinal herbs and freshly scrubbed wood drifted through the long, quiet corridors. The air was always still. It was a childhood lived in the presence of both order and empathy, where the sight of a person in need was as common as the sound of the morning bells ringing across the city. His father, Mikhail Andreevich, was a man of strict routine and deep dedication to his work as a physician, and he ensured that the household moved with a quiet and predictable rhythm that felt as steady as a heartbeat. In contrast to the orderly and sometimes stern nature of his father's world, his mother, Maria Fedorovna, brought a profound sense of warmth and spiritual gentleness into their lives every single day. She was the one who filled the rooms with the comforting and familiar smells of freshly washed linen and beeswax candles, and her voice was a constant, steady presence during the long, dark Moscow winters. She loved him deeply. Her faith was not a matter of loud declaration, but a quiet, living practice that shaped the atmosphere of the home, making it a place where even the smallest child felt noticed and secure. Every evening, after the day's work was done and the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the family would gather in the warm glow of the lamplight to listen as stories were read aloud. In these hours, the words of great writers floated through the air like soft snow, landing gently in the minds of the children as they sat together. Fyodor would sit quietly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the candles, as he listened to tales filled with adventure, ancient history, and the complicated lives of people in distant lands. Books were his closest friends. These early stories planted seeds of profound wonder in his heart, and he soon began to see the world not just as a collection of facts and figures, but as a place filled with moral questions, deep sorrow, and the quiet beauty of redemption. The summers brought a welcome shift in the landscape as the family left the heavy stone walls of the city for their small country estate at Daravoy. Here, the air was entirely different, carrying the sweet fragrance of sun-warmed grass and the sharp, clean scent of birch leaves after a light morning rain. Fyodor spent his days wandering through the open fields, feeling the dry, warm earth beneath his bare feet, and watching the intricate, busy movements of insects in the tall, swaying weeds. Nature was wide and free. The constant, muted sounds of the hospital were replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant, rhythmic call of birds echoing through the deep, shaded woods. He would often sit beneath the silver bark of a birch tree, letting the dappled sunlight fall across his face in shifting patterns as he watched the white clouds move lazily across the vast Russian sky. The birch trees seemed to whisper secrets to one another in the breeze, and the world felt infinite and kind in those golden, slow hours of his childhood. The days were incredibly long. He remembered the sharp, sweet taste of cold water drawn from the deep well and the feeling of the evening wind brushing against his skin, sensations that he would carry within him through every winter that was to follow. As the years passed and the world of childhood began to change, the family was touched by a deep and quiet sorrow in 1837 when his mother passed away. The warmth she had provided did not vanish, but it shifted into a memory, a soft and enduring light that would continue to guide him through the more difficult and lonely years that lay ahead. The house grew still. The silence in the rooms was no longer the peaceful, shared silence of an evening reading, but a heavier and more reflective stillness that settled over the family like a cold winter mist. Soon after, the time came for Fyodor and his older brother Mikhail to leave the familiar streets of Moscow and the hospital garden behind. They were destined for the Military Engineering Academy in St. Petersburg, a city of stone and mist far to the north where the wind blew cold off the water. They packed their few belongings, including the books that had become so precious to them, and prepared for the long journey away from the only home they had ever known. It was time to go. The transition from the warmth of the family apartment to the wider world was beginning, and the two brothers held on to their shared love of stories as they faced the road ahead. As the heavy carriage finally began to move, the iron wheels crunched against the gravel road, and the rhythmic, side-to-side swaying of the coach became a steady and hypnotic pulse. Fyodor sat quietly by the small window, watching the endless birch forests and the clusters of small wooden villages pass slowly by, the landscape blurring into a peaceful tapestry of greens and browns. The world was shifting. He did not feel an overwhelming sense of fear, but rather a quiet and steady curiosity about what the vast future might hold for him, and he leaned his tired head against the cool glass as the carriage carried him further toward the unknown. The distance between his childhood and his future grew with every passing mile, yet he held on to the memories of the hospital bells and the golden scent of the summer grass. The rhythm of the journey was slow and incredibly patient, and as the orange sun began to set over the rolling hills of the countryside, he felt the heavy weight of the day begin to lift from his mind. He closed his eyes. The carriage continued its steady, rhythmic crawl toward the north, and the muffled sound of the horse's hooves against the soft earth became a gentle lullaby in the deepening twilight. The city of St. Petersburg greeted Fyodor with a landscape of wide, granite embankments and a mist that rose from the cold waters of the Neva River. It was a city of stone and iron, where the streets echoed with the rhythmic sound of horses and the quiet footfalls of people moving through the gray fog. He felt the change. As he entered the Military Engineering Academy, the warmth of Moscow was replaced by the cool atmosphere of stone corridors and the disciplined routine of a cadet's life. The rooms were high and often drafty, and the air carried the faint, dry scent of chalk and old maps. He wore a heavy wool uniform that felt stiff against his skin, a reminder of the order he was now expected to follow. His days were filled with the steady, precise labor of technical drawing and mathematics, where every line had to be measured with absolute certainty. He would sit for hours over a drafting table, the weight of a heavy metal ruler in his hand, and the scratching of a pencil being the only sounds in the quiet hall. Precision was a requirement. While his classmates focused on the practicalities of fortifications, Fyodor's mind was often wandering back to the stories he had heard as a child, or exploring the thoughts of writers he had discovered in his spare time. He carried his books like quiet companions, reading them whenever the rigid schedule allowed for a moment of rest. In the year 1839, the routine of his studies was interrupted by the news of his father's death, a heavy sorrow that arrived like a distant storm. The circumstances were whispered and uncertain, yet they left a profound mark on the young man as he continued his work in the gray light of the northern city. He moved softly through the halls. The tragedy settled into the corners of his mind, waiting for the time when he would have the words to explore the fragility of human life and the complicated nature of guilt. He felt the weight of his heritage with a new and sober intensity that stayed with him long after the news had faded into a quiet memory. After completing his studies and serving as a military engineer, Fyodor made the quiet decision to leave the security of his commission behind and pursue the life of a writer. He resigned his post. This choice led him into a world of modest rented rooms and the constant flickering light of a single lamp that burned late into the cold St. Petersburg nights. His first major project was a translation of Balzac's Aux Journées Granées, a task that allowed him to immerse himself in the rhythm of language and the intricate ways that stories are constructed. The work was demanding and often lonely, yet it provided him with a sense of purpose that the world of engineering had never offered. He soon began working on a story of his own, a novel called Poor Folk that focused on the lives of those living on the margins of society. He spent his evenings at a small wooden desk, the paper edges feeling thin and cool beneath his hands as he filled sheet after sheet with the quiet struggles of his characters. The ink was dark. He would work until his eyes were heavy and the morning light touched the tops of the buildings outside his window, often accompanied only by the steam rising from a cup of cooling tea. The manuscript grew slowly, reflecting the empathy he had first learned in the hospital courtyard while he watched the patients in the garden. When the manuscript was finally finished, the response from the literary circles of the city was a warm and unexpected embrace that changed his life. The critic Belinsky recognized the profound human truth in the work, and Fyodor was introduced to the famous authors and thinkers of the capital during long evenings of conversation. He was a success. The air in the salons was filled with the scent of tobacco and the sound of lively debate, a world that felt vastly different from the quiet cell of his writing room. He moved through these spaces with wonder, realizing that his voice was finally being heard by the world he had observed from a distance for so long. However, the early praise was followed by a more difficult period, as his next novel, The Double, was met with confusion and a cooling of the public's enthusiasm. The story was more experimental and psychologically complex, and many readers were not yet ready for the deep journeys into the human mind that he was beginning to map out. The room grew still. Rather than letting the disappointment overwhelm him, Fyodor simply returned to the quiet habits that had always sustained him, finding his way back to his desk and the familiar feeling of a clean sheet of paper. The work remained constant. Even when the critics were loud or the rooms grew cold, he found peace in the scratch of his pen. He spent more time alone, reading the works of Gogol and Dickens while the city moved outside his door and the winter snow began to pile up against the window panes. The lamp on his desk was a steady point of light in the gathering darkness, casting long shadows across the stacks of books and the letters he exchanged with his brother Mikhail. He felt a commitment to his craft. Even when his financial situation grew difficult, he remained dedicated to the belief that stories were the most important way to understand the nature of the human heart and the quiet dignity of the soul. The desk was a place of sanctuary and labor, where the only thing that mattered was the movement of the pen and the slow unfolding of a new idea. He would sit there for hours, the only sound being the soft tick of a clock and the occasional rustle of paper as he turned a page or set aside a finished draft. The world was quiet. As the years of the late 1840s approached, he continued to live this life of steady effort and internal exploration, unaware of the vast changes that were waiting just beyond the horizon. He was simply a young man with a pen, a lamp, and a heart full of stories. In the late 1840s, the streets of St. Petersburg remained a place of shifting mist and golden lamplight, where Fyodor found himself drawn into the company of others who shared his restless curiosity about the world. He began attending weekly gatherings at the home of Mikhail Petrashevsky, arriving as the evening air turned crisp and the first stars appeared over the city's quiet canals. These rooms were always filled with the comforting and familiar scent of brewing tea and the faint, dry aroma of old tobacco smoke that clung to the heavy velvet curtains. The space felt alive. You would often find a seat in a corner or near the warmth of the tall porcelain stove, watching as young men in wool coats leaned forward to share books and discuss ideas that felt as urgent as they were ancient. The conversations moved with a slow and rhythmic intensity, touching on the lives of the poor, the necessity of reform, and the inherent dignity of every human being regardless of their station in life. Fyodor listened more than he spoke, his mind absorbing the various perspectives like a sponge, while he held a warm glass of tea between his hands to ward off the evening chill. The world was changing. He felt a deep and quiet connection to these thinkers who wanted to make the world a more compassionate place. And the gatherings became a steady part of his weekly routine that provided a sense of community he had long desired. The atmosphere was never one of anger, but rather of a shared and earnest hope that the future could be sculpted into something kinder and more just for all people. Outside these warm rooms, the political climate of Russia was growing increasingly restrictive and cautious under the watchful eye of Emperor Nicholas I, who viewed such intellectual circles with suspicion. Fyodor continued his writing during the day, but the evening meetings provided an intellectual sanctuary where the air felt lighter and the possibilities for the future seemed to expand with every shared thought. He felt very purposeful. He often walked home through the deserted streets after the lamps had been extinguished, the rhythmic sound of his own footsteps on the cobblestones being the only thing to break the profound silence of the sleeping city. The night was vast and still, and he felt a quiet satisfaction in the work he was doing, and the people he was beginning to know so well. Everything changed in the early hours of an April morning in 1849, when the quiet of his room was broken by a soft but persistent knocking at the door. He was arrested. The process was conducted with a strange and professional calm as officials gathered his papers and led him down the stairs into the cool, damp air of the pre-dawn twilight, where a carriage was waiting. There was no sound in the street except for the heavy breathing of the horses and the occasional clink of metal harness as they began the slow journey toward the Peter and Paul fortress. The city looked different in the gray, uncertain light of the early morning, the buildings appearing like ghosts through the thin veil of mist that rose from the river. As the heavy iron gates of the fortress closed behind him, Fyodor was led through long and narrow stone corridors where the air was noticeably cooler and carried the scent of ancient dust and damp earth. He was placed in a solitary cell, a small and quiet space, where the only window was set high in the thick wall and allowed only a narrow sliver of pale daylight to reach the floor. The door was heavy. He sat on the edge of the narrow wooden bed, listening as the sound of the guard's footsteps gradually faded into the distance and left him in a silence that felt more profound than any he had ever known. The walls were cold and unyielding, yet he found that his mind remained active and clear even as the boundaries of his physical world were suddenly and sharply reduced. His life soon settled into a new and incredibly slow rhythm that was dictated by the movement of the light across the stones and the predictable arrival of simple meals. He spent hours watching the dust motes dance in the single beam of sunlight that moved across the cell, finding a strange and quiet beauty in the way the air seemed to shimmer in the middle of the afternoon. Time felt very different. Without his books or his writing desk, he turned his attention inward, replaying the stories he had read as a child and remembering the warmth of the hospital garden in Moscow with a clarity that surprised him. He began to observe his own thoughts with the same care he had once used to observe his characters, finding that even in the stillness of a cell, the human mind is never truly alone. The months passed with a steady and patient monotony as he underwent interrogation and waited for the authorities to decide his fate in the quiet offices of the fortress. He learned to recognize the specific sounds of the prison routine, such as the rhythmic rattle of the keys and the muffled voices of the guards talking in the distant hallway during the long evening hours. The shadows grew long. He exercised by walking in small circles within the confined space, feeling the rough texture of the stone walls beneath his fingertips and the way the cool air brushed against his face as he moved. He was learning to live within the silence, discovering that even when every external comfort is removed, there's a core of resilience and observation that remains untouched and steady. He often stood by the high window, looking up at the small patch of blue sky and watching the white clouds move past with a freedom that he had once taken for granted. The world outside continued its own busy and indifferent rhythm, yet he felt a deepening sense of empathy for all living things as he sat in the quiet of his confinement. Nature was far away. He thought of his brother Mikhail and the letters they had exchanged, and he found comfort in the memory of the shared stories that had first ignited his imagination in the lamplight of their childhood home. These memories were like small, glowing coals that he kept warm within his heart, providing a sense of continuity and peace that the cold stone walls could not take away. As the year moved toward its end and the first snow began to fall outside the fortress walls, Fyodor remained in his cell, measuring the passing days by the gradual fading of the light. He did not know what the next day would bring, but he had developed a quiet and steady routine of listening and remembering that allowed him to face the uncertainty with a calm heart. The room was peaceful. He would lie down on his narrow bed as the darkness filled the cell, listening to the distant and muffled sound of the water lapping against the stone foundations of the fortress. The world was waiting, and as he closed his eyes, he felt the heavy weight of the silence become a gentle and protective layer that carried him toward the quiet and dreamless rest of another night. The winter morning of December 22nd, 1849, arrived with a biting chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of the fortress. Fyodor was led from his cell and placed into a carriage with his fellow prisoners, the metal wheels making a sharp and brutal sound as they moved over the frozen streets of St. Petersburg. The air was crisp. As the carriage slowed and the heavy wooden doors were opened, the group stepped out into the vast open space of Semyonovsky Square, where the pale sun was just beginning to touch the distant golden domes of the city's cathedrals. The light was very thin. He felt the weight of his heavy wool coat against his shoulders and the sharp sting of the wind against his cheeks. Sensations that felt unusually vivid and precious in the profound stillness of the morning. They were stood in a line on a raised wooden platform, surrounded by the silent ranks of soldiers and the muffled murmur of a small crowd that had gathered in the distance. A long informal document was read aloud by an official, the words echoing through the cold air as the death sentence was announced for each man in turn. The square grew quiet. Fyodor stood beside his friends, watching the white plumes of his own breath rise and vanish into the gray sky, realizing that he was looking at the world with the eyes of a man who believed he had only minutes remaining. He noticed the way the light caught the frost on the ground and the specific, intricate patterns of the soldiers' uniforms, finding a strange and quiet beauty in the most ordinary of details. The preparations for the end were conducted with a slow and rhythmic precision that allowed no room for hurry or panic. 3 men were led forward to the wooden posts, their eyes covered with white hoods that fluttered slightly in the winter breeze as the soldiers raised their rifles and waited for the final command. Time seemed to stretch. Fyodor calculated that he had perhaps 5 minutes of life left, and he decided to spend them looking at the church domes and the people around him, wanting to hold on to the image of the living world for as long as possible. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the simple fact of his existence, realizing that every second was a gift that he had never fully appreciated until it was about to be taken away. Just as the command was expected, a messenger on horseback arrived at the square with a white handkerchief held high in the air, bringing news that the emperor had granted a reprieve. The rifles were lowered. It was later revealed that the entire scene had been a carefully orchestrated mock execution, designed to provide a final warning and a lasting impression on the young thinkers who had gathered in the city's quiet rooms. Fyodor felt a wave of exhausted relief wash over him, but it was not a loud emotion. Rather, it was a quiet and heavy realization that his journey was not yet over. His life had been returned. The weight of the moment settled deep within him, changing the way he would view time and mortality for the rest of his years. This morning in the snow would remain the central point of his memory, a private and reflective space that he would revisit many times in his later stories and notebooks. He would eventually write about a man who stands before a firing squad, describing the intense clarity of the final moments and the profound wish to live even the most difficult and humble of lives. The world felt new. He understood now that life was not a series of achievements, but a continuous and quiet opportunity to show compassion and to notice the beauty in the ordinary movement of the day. The memory of the white hoods and the frozen ground would never leave him, serving as a steady reminder that every breath was a chance to begin again with a more patient and open heart. The death sentence was commuted to 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison camp, followed by a period of compulsory military service as a private soldier. The square was cleared. Fyodor was led back to the fortress to prepare for the long journey eastward, his mind still hovering between the world he had almost left and the vast unknown landscape that lay ahead of him. He was given a set of heavy iron shackles that were riveted around his ankles, the cold metal feeling heavy and strange as he took his first awkward steps toward the waiting transport. The iron was very cold, The weight of the chains was a constant and rhythmic reminder of the change in his status, yet he accepted it with a quiet and steady resignation that surprised even himself. On Christmas Eve, the journey finally began as the prisoners were placed in open sleighs for the long and frigid trip across the Russian countryside toward the Ural Mountains. The city of St. Petersburg slowly faded into the distance, its lights becoming small and flickering points of gold against the vast and darkening blue of the winter sky. The snow was deep. The only sound was the steady and rhythmic crunch of the sleigh runners over the frozen ground and the occasional muffled call of the drivers as they encouraged the horses through the heavy drifts. Fyodor wrapped his heavy coat more tightly around him, watching the endless forests of pine and birch move past in a slow and hypnotic blur of white and shadow. As the night deepened and the stars began to appear in the clear, cold air, he felt the heavy rhythm of the journey begin to pull him into a state of quiet and dreamless rest. The world was vast. He did not know what the years in the prison camp would bring, but he felt a sense of peace in the steady movement of the sleigh and the knowledge that he was still a part of the living world. The runners hummed. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the horses' hooves and the cold wind against his face become a gentle and protective lullaby that carried him further away from the city of his youth. The journey was long and incredibly patient, and as the sleigh continued its rhythmic crawl into the east, he felt the weight of the day vanish into the quiet of the Siberian night. The sleigh ride finally ended at the gates of the Omsk fortress, a place where the horizon was a flat line of white against the pale winter sky. Fyodor stepped onto the frozen ground, the weight of his chains clinking softly as he moved toward the heavy timber walls that would be his home for the next 4 years. The air was very cold. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the damp, earthy smell of many people living in a confined space. He was assigned a spot on the long wooden platforms that served as beds, where the rough-hewn planks felt hard beneath his back after the long journey. His days began with the rhythmic sound of the morning drum, a steady beat that echoed through the cold barracks and signaled the start of another day of labor. He spent his hours performing heavy tasks like hauling logs or grinding plaster, feeling the slow and predictable strain in his muscles as he worked beside men from every corner of the empire. The work was constant. While the physical exertion was demanding, he found a strange kind of peace in the simplicity of the movements and the way the time seemed to dissolve into a series of repetitive actions. He would often look up from his work to see the vast, empty sky stretching out forever, a reminder that the world was still large and filled with quiet possibilities. The seasons in Siberia moved with a slow and heavy deliberation, shifting from the blinding white of winter to the dusty, sun-baked heat of the brief northern summer. Fyodor learned to find beauty in the smallest of things, such as the way the frost formed intricate patterns on the barrack windows, or the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the old timber walls. He moved softly. In the summer months, he would watch the tall grass swaying in the breeze beyond the prison enclosure, its green color appearing incredibly bright and hopeful against the gray stones of the fortress. The world was alive. He found that even in a place of confinement, nature continued its patient and indifferent rhythm, offering a sense of continuity that he found deeply comforting during the long hours of his isolation. One of the few books allowed inside the prison was a copy of the New Testament, which he kept close at hand and read by the flickering light of a small candle during the long evening hours. The pages were thin. He found comfort in the familiar words, letting them settle into his mind like a soft blanket and providing him with a sense of internal order that the prison walls could not provide. He would lie awake for a long time, listening to the heavy breathing of his fellow prisoners and the distant, lonely howl of the wind outside the barracks. The night was very long. In these quiet moments, he revisited the memories of his childhood and the stories he had once written, realizing that the human spirit has a remarkable capacity to preserve beauty even in the most difficult of circumstances. He became a quiet observer of the people around him, noticing the small gestures of kindness and the complicated histories that each man carried within himself like a hidden treasure. He saw that even those who had committed the most difficult acts were capable of moments of generosity or a quiet reflection on a home they had lost long ago. People were complex. His earlier ideas about morality began to shift and soften, as he realized that the line between good and evil was often as thin as a thread and as winding as a forest path. He began to see the dignity in every face, regardless of their past, and this realization brought him a sense of profound and quiet empathy that would later shape every word he wrote. During these years, he also experienced the onset of physical challenges that would stay with him for the rest of his life, including the quiet and strange arrival of seizures. These moments were not frightening in his memory, but rather felt like a temporary suspension of time, followed by a period of deep and heavy rest. The room grew still. He accepted these experiences as part of the rhythm of his life, finding that they allowed him to see the world with a different kind of clarity and a heightened awareness of the fragility of the present moment. He would recover slowly, resting his head on his rough pillow while the light shifted across the timber walls and the voices of the other men became a distant, comforting murmur. To pass the time, he would close his eyes and imagine the warm sun on the hospital garden in Moscow, or the sound of his mother's voice as she read to him by the evening fire. These memories were incredibly vivid. He could almost smell the scent of the birch leaves and feel the dry grass beneath his feet, and these mental journeys provided him with a sanctuary that the prison guards could never touch. He realized that a person can be free even behind iron bars if their mind is filled with the stories and the faces of those they have loved. The world was within him. He held on to these images with a patient and steady heart, knowing that they were the most important things he possessed. The meals in the prison were simple and repetitive, consisting of coarse bread and cabbage soup that provided a steady and predictable rhythm to the passing days. He sat on a low wooden bench, holding a warm metal cup between his hands and watching the steam rise quietly into the cool air of the dining hall. The soup was warm. He found that he began to appreciate the basic comforts of food and shelter with a new intensity, realizing that the most ordinary of things were often the most precious when they were limited. He would listen to the clatter of spoons and the low murmur of conversation, finding a sense of community in the shared experience of survival that transcended the barriers of social rank. The 4 years at Omsk slowly drew to a close, measured by the changing of the seasons and the gradual wearing down of the wooden planks beneath his feet. In early 1854, the heavy shackles were finally removed from his ankles, and he stood for a moment in the silence of the forge, feeling the strange and wonderful lightness of his own body. He was free from the prison. However, his sentence required him to serve as a private soldier in a remote garrison, and he prepared to move toward a new kind of life that was still far from the city of his youth. He walked out of the prison gates and looked up at the sun, which felt warm and welcoming on his face after so many winters. He spent his first night outside the walls in a small wooden house where the air was clean and the silence was no longer heavy with the presence of hundreds of other people. He sat by an open window, watching the stars appear one by one over the Siberian steppe and feeling the gentle breeze move through the room. The horizon was wide. He knew that he had been changed by the years of labor and the people he had met, but he felt a sense of quiet readiness for whatever the future might hold. The journey was still unfolding. As he lay down to sleep, he felt the heavy rhythm of his breathing match the vast and patient pulse of the world, and he closed his eyes with a heart that was full of a new and enduring kind of peace. After leaving the walls of the Omsk fortress behind, the world opened up into the vast and rolling landscape of the Kazakh steppe, where the horizon seemed to stretch toward the very edge of the sky. Fyodor was posted as a private soldier in the remote garrison town of Semipalatinsk, a place of low wooden houses and wide, dusty streets that were often filled with the scent of sun-warmed earth and dry grass. He wore the heavy gray coat and polished buttons of a common infantryman, yet the weight of the military routine felt significantly lighter than the chains he had carried for so long. The air was incredibly open. As he performed his daily duties, he felt the gradual return of a world he had nearly forgotten, one where he could walk through the town and see the faces of people who were not behind iron bars. The years of silence and isolation began to thaw as he was slowly granted the permission to write and receive letters, a privilege that felt like a bridge being rebuilt across a wide and dark river. He received the first letters from his brother Mikhail with a sense of profound wonder, holding the thin paper in his hands and feeling the texture of the familiar handwriting beneath his fingertips. The ink was a deep blue. He spent his quiet evening hours at a small wooden table, carefully unfolding the pages and reading the news of the literary world in St. Petersburg, while his tea grew cool in a glass beside him. These messages were like small pieces of his former life returning to him one by one, and he felt a quiet and growing hope that his own voice might one day find its way back to the pages of a book. In this remote corner of the empire, he also found the comfort of new friendships that helped to heal the loneliness of his long exile. He formed a deep and intellectual bond with Shokan Walikhanov, a young Kazakh scholar and traveler who shared his love for the vast landscapes and the complicated histories of the people who lived there. They would sit together in the long twilight of the steppe, watching the stars appear over the rolling hills while they discussed literature, philosophy, and the quiet dignity of the human spirit. The conversations were very steady. This friendship provided Fyodor with a sense of connection to the wider world and reminded him that the exchange of ideas was a vital part of the life he was working so patiently to reclaim. The most significant change in his life arrived through his relationship with Maria Dmitrievna Iseva, a woman whose presence brought a new and complicated layer of tenderness into his daily routine. Their early courtship was marked by a sense of uncertainty and a deep, quiet respect as they moved through the small social circles of the garrison town together. He felt a profound sense of responsibility toward her, and their conversations often took place during long walks in the cool evening air or over a shared meal in a brightly lit room. The heart is very slow. The emotional landscape was not one of sudden drama, but of a gradual and patient unfolding, much like the way the spring flowers finally appear after a long and heavy Siberian winter. They were married in 1857, a ceremony that took place in a small and quiet church as the morning light touched the icons and the scent of incense filled the air. This union represented a new chapter of stability and human companionship, even as the challenges of their shared life remained present in the modest rooms they occupied. He felt a deep commitment. Fyodor continued his military service with a sense of purpose, knowing that every day brought him closer to the possibility of a full return to the life he had left behind in the capital. The routine was predictable and calm, and he found that he could now look back on his years in the prison camp with a sense of reflective distance that allowed him to begin thinking about his writing once again. The permission to resign from his military post and return to European Russia finally arrived in 1859, a news that was met with a quiet and exhausted sense of relief. They packed their belongings into a carriage once again, but this time the journey was westward, moving toward the familiar cities and the people who had been waiting for his return for over a decade. They stayed for a short time in the town of Ter, where the air felt softer and the trees were tall and green against the pale blue sky of central Russia. The world was coming closer. He spent his days watching the river and waiting for the final permission to enter St. Petersburg, feeling the weight of his experiences settling into a new and more mature understanding of the world. By the end of 1859, Fyodor was finally back in the city of stone and mist, standing on the same granite embankments where he had walked as a young and uncertain engineer many years before. The city felt both familiar and strange, its wide streets filled with the same rhythmic sound of horses and the quiet footfalls of people moving through the gray winter light. He moved softly through the familiar neighborhoods. He found that the literary world had changed, yet there was a growing curiosity about the man who had returned from the frozen east with stories that no one else could tell. He began to reconnect with his brother Mikhail, and together they launched a new literary journal called Vremya, which they hoped would provide a space for a new kind of conversation about the nature of Russian life. The publication of his new works, including The Insulted and the Injured and Notes from the House of the Dead, marked his official re-entry into the world he had missed so deeply. The public began to recognize the profound depth and the quiet power of the experiences he had brought home with him from the Siberian steppe. He wrote with a new and steady intensity, his pen moving across the paper with the rhythmic certainty of a man who knows exactly what he wants to say. The work was demanding. He would spend his evenings in a quiet room, the only sound being the soft scratching of his pen and the occasional rustle of a page as he turned it over to start a new chapter. His descriptions of the prison camp and the people he had met there were not written with anger, but with a compassionate and reflective gaze that sought to find the humanity in even the most difficult of places. Readers were moved by the quiet dignity of his characters and the way he explored the moral complexity of the human heart with such patience and care. The rooms were very still. He felt a sense of fulfillment in the knowledge that his words were finally being heard again, and the journal became a successful and respected part of the intellectual life of the capital during the early 1860s. The transition was complete, and he was no longer a prisoner or a soldier, but once again a writer with a heart full of stories. The final rhythm of this period was the gentle and mechanical sound of the printing press, a steady and hypnotic pulse that carried his words from the quiet of his room out into the busy streets of the city. He would visit the printing house in the early morning, watching as the large metal wheels turned and the fresh sheets of paper moved through the machinery with a rhythmic and predictable grace. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of fresh ink and the dry aroma of warm paper. It was a sound of continuation. As the stacks of finished pages grew higher, he felt a sense of peace in the knowledge that his life had returned to a state of creative labor and quiet purpose, and he walked home through the cooling evening air with a heart that was finally at rest. In the early 1860s, Fyodor crossed the borders of Russia for the first time, traveling toward the grand boulevards and ancient stone cathedrals of Western Europe. He visited Paris and London, walking through streets that felt sharp with the movement of a modern world that was changing more quickly than he could fully understand. The air was different. He often found that the grand architecture only made him miss the birch forests and the familiar bells of the Moscow hospitals he had known as a child. He felt like a traveler in a land that was not his own, carrying the weight of his memories like a collection of precious stones. The contrast was clear. While Europe felt focused on the future, Fyodor's mind remained anchored in the patient questions of the human heart. The year 1864 brought a period of deep and quiet sorrow as he faced the loss of his wife Maria and his brother Mikhail within only a few short months. The house grew still. This grief settled over his writing desk like a slow-moving autumn mist, making the days feel long and the rooms unusually quiet. He was alone. He captured this sense of isolation and internal struggle in a new work called Notes from Underground. While the journals he had built with Mikhail were gone, and his attempt to continue their work through a new publication called Epocha was met with heavy financial strain. He found himself responsible for his brother's family and a collection of debts that required his constant and weary attention. He moved through the world with exhausted dedication. To find a temporary escape from the pressures of his life, he began to spend time in the quiet, carpeted halls of European casino towns like Wiesbaden and Dresden. The atmosphere in these rooms was one of hushed intensity, where the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the roulette wheel as it spun in the low light. The wheel was very steady. He was not searching for wealth so much as a moment of suspension where the reality of his deadlines could be set aside. He watched the small white ball move with a predictable grace, finding a strange kind of peace in the repetition. The cycle was always the same. He would return to his modest hotel room as the light touched the rooftops, his mind already turning back to the sheets of paper on the desk. He began working on a novel called Crime and Punishment, a story that took him deep into the winding streets and the hot, dusty apartments of St. Petersburg. He wrote in the late hours of the night, the only sound being the soft scratching of his pen and the distant call of a boatman on the canal. The room was warm. He explored the nature of conscience and the possibility of redemption, moving through the thoughts of his characters with the same patience he used to navigate the mist of his own life. The work was demanding and often lonely, yet it provided him with a sense of purpose that remained steady even when the world outside felt unstable. In the autumn of 1866, the pressure of his financial situation culminated in a contract that required him to complete a new novel in only 26 days. He needed a way to move faster. A young woman named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina was recommended as a stenographer, and she arrived at his door with a sense of practical calm. She was 20 years old. Anna sat at a small table with her pencil sharpened and her notebooks open, waiting for him to begin the task of dictating the story. The air felt lighter. They developed a routine that was disciplined and gentle, a shared labor that allowed the words to move from his mind to the paper. Their days were measured by the soft scratching of pencils and the occasional clink of a spoon against a glass of warm tea. Fyodor would pace the floor, his voice moving through the room like a quiet river as he told the story of the gambler. The pencils moved softly. She provided a stabilizing presence that helped to anchor his restless mind and allowed him to focus with a renewed sense of clarity and hope. The room was a sanctuary. Outside, the autumn wind blew the dry leaves against the window, but inside, the only thing that mattered was the movement of the story and the growing bond between two people in the silence between sentences. As the stacks of transcribed pages grew higher, the earlier sense of pressure was replaced by a feeling of quiet and focused cooperation. They worked until the shadows grew long and the lamps were lit, their voices becoming a low and comforting murmur in the stillness of the evening. The work was constant. Anna's practical management of the manuscripts and her unwavering calm provided Fyodor with a sense of security he had not known for many years, and he began to look forward to her arrival. He felt very grateful. The deadline that had once seemed so threatening was now only a milestone in a much larger journey. When the novel was finally finished, Fyodor realized that the quiet of his room felt empty whenever Anna was not there to share the work. He decided to ask her to stay in his life, but he chose to do so by telling her a story about an older artist who wondered if a young and kind woman could ever truly care for him. His voice was very gentle. He sat by the window, watching the gray light of the afternoon, while he waited for her response, his heart feeling both heavy and hopeful in the profound silence of the room. Anna understood the truth behind the story, and her acceptance brought a sense of enduring peace to the small apartment. This new partnership represented a shift from the isolation of his earlier years toward a life that was supported by the care of someone who understood his work. The room was peaceful. The pressure of the deaths remained, but they were now faced by two people, and the weight felt manageable in the warm light of their shared purpose. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, the only sound was the soft rustle of the finished manuscript. The world outside drifted toward sleep. He leaned back in his chair and felt the heavy rhythm of his own heart matching the patient pulse of a life that was finally finding its way home. In February of 1867, Fyodor and Anna were married in a quiet ceremony that marked the beginning of a partnership that would sustain him through the final chapters of his life. The winter air was still crisp as they prepared to leave St. Petersburg for a journey through Europe, a trip they initially believed would last only a few months. The city was quiet. As the train pulled away from the station, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the iron tracks became a steady and hypnotic pulse that carried them away from the creditors and the heavy pressure of their daily lives. Fyodor sat by the window, watching the familiar Russian landscape of snow and birch trees gradually transform into the rolling hills and orderly towns of the western lands. The world was wide. He felt a sense of quiet relief in the movement, as if the distance was a soft blanket being drawn over the difficulties of the past several years. They traveled through Germany and settled for a time in Dresden, where the streets were lined with ancient stone buildings and the air carried the scent of roasting coffee and damp river mist. Anna took charge of their small household with a practical and steady calm, managing their modest funds and organizing the manuscripts that Fyodor continued to produce during the quiet morning hours. She was very capable. Their rooms were filled with the soft light of the northern sun, and they spent their afternoons walking through the art galleries or sitting in the public gardens where the fountains splashed gently into stone basins. Fyodor found a sense of peace in these structured days, and he spent long hours in front of Holbein's painting of the Dead Christ, finding in its stark realism a profound connection to the questions of faith and mortality that always occupied his mind. Despite the stability of his marriage, the old compulsion for the roulette wheel returned during their time in the casino towns of Germany and Switzerland. He would travel alone to the gaming halls, moving through the hushed and carpeted rooms where the only sound was the rhythmic spinning of the wheel and the quiet announcement of the numbers. The cycle was repetitive. He often returned to Anna with a heart full of regret and the pocket that was empty. Yet she met these moments with a patient and unwavering kindness that allowed him to begin again each time. The air was still. This struggle with his own nature was a difficult and heavy part of their early years together. Yet it also deepened their bond as they navigated the consequences with a shared and quiet dedication to their future. In the spring of 1868, their first daughter, Sophia, was born in the city of Geneva, bringing a new and profound sense of joy into their modest rented rooms. The air was warm. Fyodor spent his days watching the small movements of the infant and feeling a tenderness that seemed to soften the edges of his restless mind. However, this happiness was touched by a deep and quiet sorrow when Sophia passed away only a few months later during the heat of the summer. The house grew still. He moved through the rooms with a heavy and reflective step, finding that the silence of the apartment was now a place of shared grief, that he and Anna held together with a patient and enduring grace. The loss was profound. They walked through the quiet streets of Geneva as the sun set over the lake, finding comfort in the steady movement of the water and the knowledge that they were not alone in their sorrow. During this period of grief and travel, Fyodor was working on a novel called The Idiot, in which he attempted to portray a person of absolute and uncomplicated compassion. He wrote in various cities, including Florence, where the bells of the great cathedrals rang out over the Arno River in a slow and rhythmic sequence that measured his days. The work was constant. He spent his evenings at a small wooden desk, the light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the pages as he explored the ways that a gentle soul might navigate a world filled with complexity and pride. The ink was dark. He found that the act of storytelling was a way to process his own experiences and to seek out a sense of moral clarity that remained steady even when the external world felt uncertain and strange. A second daughter, Lubov, was born in the autumn of 1869, bringing a renewed sense of hope and a more stable rhythm to their family life. She was a healthy child. Her presence filled the rooms with a new kind of energy and a quiet sense of continuity that helped to heal the lingering sorrow of their earlier loss. Fyodor found himself more grounded in the daily routines of parenthood, watching as Lubov grew and began to explore the world with a curiosity that reminded him of his own childhood beside the hospital garden. The days were long. He would sit by the window with the child on his lap, watching the clouds move over the European rooftops and feeling a sense of gratitude for the simple and quiet moments of domestic peace. As the years passed, they continued to move between rented rooms in various cities, including Dresden and Prague, while Fyodor worked on the ideas that would eventually become the novel Demons. He felt a deep and growing connection to his homeland, and he spent many hours reading Russian newspapers and letters that arrived from his friends in St. Petersburg. The distance was narrowing. He felt that his time in Europe had given him a new perspective on the nature of Russian life, and he was eager to return to the familiar streets and the people who shared his language and his history. The suitcases were always nearby. Anna continued to manage their travels with a steady and practical hand, ensuring that his manuscripts were kept safe and that their lives remained orderly despite the frequent changes in their surroundings. By 1871, the gambling compulsion that had once been such a heavy weight on his life had gradually faded into a quiet and distant memory. He felt a sense of freedom. The cycle of loss and regret was replaced by a more predictable and productive routine of writing and family care, and he felt a growing confidence in his ability to provide for his wife and children through his literary labor. The air was clear. He and Anna made the quiet decision to return to Russia, realizing that they had found a way to face the future together with a sense of shared purpose and a deep, mutual respect. They began to pack their trunks with the books and papers they had gathered during their 4 years away, preparing for the long journey back to the city of their youth. The final days in Europe were spent in a state of quiet and reflective preparation as they said goodbye to the cities and the landscapes that had been their home for so long. The light was soft. Fyodor walked through the familiar streets one last time, listening to the sound of the fountains and the distant ring of the church bells with a sense of completion. He felt that he was returning to Russia not as the man who had left, but as someone who had been matured by the experiences of loss, travel, and the steady support of a loving partnership. The journey was coming full circle. As they boarded the train that would take them back toward the east, he felt the heavy rhythm of the engine start to pull them toward the horizon with a patient and inevitable grace. The trunks were placed carefully in the luggage compartment, containing the finished manuscripts of the books he had written during their years abroad. The train moved slowly. Fyodor sat beside Anna and Lubov, watching as the European countryside began to give way to the familiar forests and the wide, open skies of the Russian borderlands. The air was cooling. He felt a sense of peace in the steady movement of the carriage and the knowledge that they were finally going home to a place where his voice was known and his heart was at rest. The clatter of the wheels was a gentle lullaby. He closed his eyes as the sun began to set over the rolling fields, letting the rhythmic pulse of the journey carry him toward the quiet and dreamless sleep of a traveler who has finally found his way back. The return to St. Petersburg in 1871 felt like a quiet arrival at a familiar harbor after a long and sometimes stormy voyage. Fyodor and Anna moved into a modest apartment where the air was soon filled with the soft, rhythmic sounds of a growing family and the steady, productive movement of a writer's home. Anna was the heart of the order. She managed the accounts and the publishing details with a quiet efficiency that allowed Fyodor to focus his energy on the stories that were still waiting to be told. The rooms were warm and smelled of beeswax and old books. Their son Fyodor was born that same year, adding another layer of gentle activity to the household and providing a sense of renewal that made the difficult years in Europe feel like a distant and fading dream. They discovered the town of Storia Russa, a place where the air carried the scent of apple blossoms and the river moved with a slow and patient grace through the green landscape. This became their summer sanctuary. Fyodor loved the feeling of the wooden floors beneath his feet and the sight of the garden where the children played in the dappled sunlight of the long Russian afternoons. The bells were distant. He would sit on the veranda, watching the curtains move softly in the warm breeze, while he planned the chapters of his next major project, a novel called Demons. The world was quiet and incredibly steady. In these golden hours, he felt a deep connection to the earth and the simple rhythms of life that had always provided him with his greatest sense of peace. He would often walk down to the riverbank as the sun began to set, watching the light catch the small ripples in the water and the way the reeds swayed gently in the cooling air. Nature was very patient. The sounds of the children's laughter drifted across the garden, a sound that he carried within him as he returned to his desk in the evening. He felt a sense of profound safety in the predictability of the seasons and the warmth of the small wooden house that had become their true home. The days were long. Every evening, the family would gather for a simple meal, the clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation, creating a tapestry of sound that felt both ancient and new. As the 1870s progressed, Fyodor's role in the public life of Russia began to shift as he became a voice that people turned to for reflection and understanding. He edited a journal called The Citizen and later began publishing installments of A Writer's Diary, a project that allowed him to speak directly to his readers about the small and large questions of the day. The work was steady. He wrote about memories of his childhood, the lives of the poor, and the beauty he found in the faces of the people he met on the streets of the capital. His readers felt a connection. The diary became a conversation that spanned the vast distance of the empire, and he found a sense of fulfillment in knowing that his observations were helping others to navigate their own lives. The household continued to grow with the birth of their younger son Alexei, who was known to everyone in the family as Alyosha. He was a child of gentle spirit and wide, curious eyes. The rooms of their apartment were often filled with the sound of his laughter and the quiet footfalls of the children moving between the study and the kitchen. Fyodor found a special kind of joy in these small moments, realizing that the family he had built with Anna was the most important and enduring of all his achievements. The light was golden. He would often stop his writing to listen to the children's voices in the adjoining room, feeling a sense of profound and quiet gratitude for the stability and the warmth that had finally come to define his daily life. In 1878, a deep and heavy shadow fell over the family when young Alyosha passed away at the age of 3. The house grew very still. The silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of a working afternoon, but a profound and reflective stillness that seemed to settle into every corner of the rooms like a cold mist. Fyodor and Anna held their grief with a patient and mutual grace, finding comfort in their shared memories and the quiet support they provided for one another through the long evening hours. The world was hushed. He moved through the days with a slow and heavy heart, realizing that this loss would become a permanent part of the landscape of his mind and the foundation of his future work. To find a sense of spiritual perspective, Fyodor traveled to the Avtina monastery with his friend Vladimir Solovyov, a philosopher who shared his interest in the deep questions of the human soul. They walked together along the shaded paths of the monastery grounds, listening to the soft murmur of the monks' voices and the rhythmic tolling of the prayer bells that echoed through the trees. The air was clean. He spent hours in conversation with the elders, finding a sense of peace in their simple wisdom and the quiet atmosphere of the ancient stone buildings. This journey provided him with the seeds of the story he was beginning to imagine, a vast narrative about three brothers and the search for faith, forgiveness, and redemption. The family moved to a new apartment on Kuznechny Lane in St. Petersburg, a place where the rooms were high and the windows looked out over the busy life of the neighborhood. Fyodor's study was a sanctuary of books and papers, where he worked late into the night while the rest of the city slept, and the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The work was constant. He began writing The Brothers Karamazov, pouring into its pages all the observations, the sorrows, and the hopes he had gathered throughout his long and varied life. Anna was nearby. She continued to manage the business of his writing with a steady and practical hand, ensuring that he had the quiet and the time he needed to complete his final great novel. In June of 1880, Fyodor traveled to Moscow to deliver a speech at the unveiling of a monument to the poet Alexander Pushkin. The hall was filled with people from every walk of life. As he spoke about the universal nature of the Russian soul and the importance of compassion, the room became incredibly quiet, and the applause that followed was a warm and sincere embrace from a public that had grown to love him. He felt very heard. The moment was not one of personal triumph, but a rare and beautiful instance of connection between a writer and his people. After the event, he returned to the quiet and predictable rhythms of his family life in Staraya Russa, finding a sense of completion in the knowledge that his major work was finished. He spent the final productive summer months resting in the garden and watching the river move past, feeling a sense of peace in the simple movement of the days. The world was still. He and Anna walked through the orchards as the apples began to ripen, talking quietly about the future and the children who were growing so quickly before their eyes. He felt a deep and enduring sense of safety in the steady presence of the people he loved and the comfort of the familiar wooden house. The air was cooling. As the evening light touched the tops of the birch trees, he would sit on the veranda and watch the shadows grow long across the grass, listening to the distant and comforting murmur of the town as it drifted towards sleep. He thought of the journey he had taken from the hospital garden in Moscow to the prison camp in Siberia, and finally back to this peaceful house beside the river. The journey was long. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythmic sound of the water, feeling a sense of quiet readiness for the final pages of his own story that were yet to be written. The papers on his desk moved softly in the breeze from the open window, a gentle and hypnotic sound that reminded him of the constant and patient movement of life. He felt a sense of gratitude for the ink, the paper, and the hands that had held them both through so many winters and so many springs. The room was warm. As the first stars appeared over the rooftops of Staraya Russa, he leaned back in his chair and felt the steady pulse of his own heart matching the vast and patient rhythm of the world outside. The night was vast and kind, and he felt the quiet of the house become a protective layer that carried him toward the rest he had earned through the years of labor and search. The lamp beside his desk cast a soft and steady glow over the books he had loved and the pages he had filled with the complicated lives of his characters. He was at rest. As he finally drifted toward sleep, the only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves in the garden and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of his children in the adjoining rooms. The apartment on Kuznechny Lane was a place of deep and familiar comfort, where the air was always thick with the scent of old paper and the steady, rhythmic sound of the household. The windows of his study looked out onto the street, catching the gray light of the winter afternoons and the soft glow of the street lamps as the city moved into the evening. Within these walls, every object had its place, from the heavy wooden desk that had supported so many thousands of pages to the small medicine box on the side table. The room was a sanctuary. Here, he had finished the immense and complicated story of the Karamazov family, a work that gathered together all the questions he had been asking since his childhood beside the hospital garden. He felt a sense of completion in the work, yet his mind remained curious, already beginning to imagine the new stories that might follow, if the time was granted to him. The physical challenges he had carried for many years began to settle more heavily as the winter of 1881 arrived with its usual damp and biting chill. He faced the limitations of his body with the same patient resignation he had learned during the long years in the Siberian fortress. In late January, a pulmonary hemorrhage required him to remain in his bed, where the room was kept warm and the light was dimmed to a soft and protective level. Anna remained by his side with her unwavering calm, her presence being a steady anchor as the family gathered in the quiet of the adjoining rooms. He moved softly. The final hours were marked not by drama or grand statements, but by a gentle and intimate exchange of words with those he loved most in the world. On the evening of January 28, 1881, Fyodor Dostoevsky passed away with a sense of peace that was as profound as it was quiet. The sound of the crowd at his public funeral remained distant, for the true heart of his story remained in the still and silent room where the writing had taken place. His legacy was an enduring willingness to sit with the complicated contradictions of the human heart and to find the beauty in even the most difficult of lives. He had written for the proud and the lonely, creating a world where every person was seen with a compassionate and reflective gaze. His books were invitations. They were places where a reader could find their own struggles reflected with a patience that offered a sense of companionship in the middle of the night. He never forgot the winter morning on Semyonovsky Square, when he had stood before the firing squad and believed his life was ending. That experience had taught him that the value of an ordinary day is found in the smallest of gestures and the quietest of moments. A lesson he had carried through every page he ever filled with ink. He understood that survival is not just a matter of staying alive, but of continuing to search for compassion and the chance to begin again with an open heart. The world is very patient. He had moved from the cold of the prison camp to the warmth of a family garden, proving that even the most arduous journey can lead back to a place of rest and quiet purpose. His life was a testament to the spirit's capacity to preserve beauty, even when the rooms are cold and the future is uncertain. Now, as the story of Fyodor Dostoevsky reaches its own gentle conclusion, the world around you begins to recede into a soft and distant blur. The history and the dates and the names are slowly fading away, leaving only the feeling of the quiet room and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. The weight in your body has completely vanished, and your head is supported by the cool texture of the pillow as the night air moves gently across your skin. You are perfectly still. The sounds of the day have vanished into the silence, and the only thing that remains is the peaceful and predictable pulse of the present moment. The journey is over. You are safe and surrounded by the promise of a deep and dreamless rest that will carry you through until the morning light. The house is quiet, and the darkness allows every restless thought to finally settle into the soft and waiting earth. You feel a sense of profound and effortless calm as the boundaries of the world grow thin and the quiet of the night becomes your only companion. The sheets are cool. Every exhale carries you further into a state of absolute and heavy relaxation, where there is nothing left to do and nowhere else you need to be. The stories have all been told. You are drifting now, moving toward the edge of sleep with a heart that is full of peace and a mind that is finally ready to let go of the day. The darkness is kind. As you sink deeper into the softness of the bed, the last echoes of the world disappear into a space of perfect and enduring silence. The lamp is low, the pages are still, and your breathing moves softly through the quiet.